Hello and welcome to the webinar where we are going to talk about the root cause of all conflict and how to ultimately get unstuck for good. Here's what we are going to cover in the next 30 minutes or so. Number one, we're going to talk about primary emotions versus secondary responses and how this relates to conflict. We are going to talk about fight versus flight responses to relationship stress. We're going to talk about the difference between vulnerability and self-protection. And we are going to take a look at the 7 core human needs at the roots of all conflict. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you some action steps that you can take away so you can ultimately get unstuck for good. Okay, hello, my name is Quentin Hafner, and why am I even qualified to talk on this subject? So I spend most of my days working with clients as a therapist and a team dynamics consultant for organizations sorting out some really difficult relationship issues. I'm the author of a marriage book for husbands, and the majority of my career has been helping people get the most out of their relationships, both personally and professionally. I believe that life is all about relationships. It's the relationship that we develop with ourselves and others. And unmanaged and unhealthy conflict is one of the most sure ways for any of us to live very frustrating lives. On a personal note, I'm happily married to my wife named Hillary, and we have 2 young sons, and we live in Orange County, California. So nice to meet you. Okay, let's get started. What is the deal with conflict anyway? Why do people argue with each other? Why does that happen? We call that the hot war. Or why do people avoid each other? We call that the Cold War. It's just a different kind of conflict. Why do these things happen? Well, they happen for 2 reasons. And there's 2 parts that I want to share with you that are at the genesis of all conflict. Part 1 is because we experience negative emotions. And sometimes people might say, I feel bad. And part 2 of conflict is because we tend to look outward to make sense of those emotions. So we say to ourselves, you're the reason why I feel bad. So all conflict exists for these 2 very simple parts. We feel bad and we try to make sense of our feeling bad by looking outward. But there's a problem with this thinking and train of thought. In conflict, both people tend to feel bad, part 1, and both people tend to look outward towards the other to make sense of their emotions. That's part 2. So what happens if both people feel bad and both people think it's about the other, we get stuck and we get gridlocked. And that's when we usually experience scenarios in our lives where conflict feels really bad. To get ultimately unstuck from conflict, the answer lies in learning how to look inward at the deeper emotional meaning that is at the roots of all conflict and identifying our core human needs. All conflict is deeply emotional, and until we access or make sense of what's happening emotionally for ourselves and for those around us, we will never ultimately resolve any conflict in our lives. When we look inward instead of outward, a couple things happen. Number 1, we get out of that really difficult blame cycle where we blame the other person for our bad feelings. Number 2, we can easily make relationship repairs by identifying our core needs. So we're not blaming anymore. And once we understand the deeper emotional aspect, we can make reparations with each other by talking about that. And when we do that, we foster empathy for one another because we get to really know at a deeper level what's happening for somebody. And through that process, we get to a place where we ultimately and truly resolve the conflict instead of having one of those scenarios where we just say something like, well, we just agreed to disagree. It's really never about agreeing to disagree because it's always deeply emotional. And when we do these things here, these 4 things here, something very powerful happens. We create what we refer to as psychological safety in relationships which results in trust, security, and a greater sense of commitment. So let's take a look at how this happens. The first step along the journey of getting to the root of all conflict is learning the difference between primary emotions and secondary responses. So here we go. Emotions are broken up into two camps: primary emotions and secondary responses. Primary emotions are below the surface, meaning they are deeper emotions and are more representative of our true selves. That's why we put this line here to separate them. Primary emotions are also less obvious to see because it can be difficult for humans to expose these emotions. They cause us to feel vulnerable, and as humans, we don't really like that. We don't like doing that too much when we don't feel psychologically safe. Secondary responses, or sometimes they're called secondary emotions, but I like to refer to them as secondary responses, are secondary because they're always driven by primary emotions. So they come in response to primary emotions, or they come in second place to primary emotions. It doesn't mean that they're less important, but there's a linear aspect here that primary emotions always drive secondary responses. And as these arrows indicate, I'm showing you graphically the linear motion of primary emotions going into secondary responses. Another way to think about this is that primary emotions are considered causal and secondary responses are the effect. So it's another way to think about how the flow of these emotions work. And we're going to get to in a second. We'll see why this is so critical to understand this aspect. Another way to think about primary emotions and secondary responses is that primary emotions are the emotions that we feel when we are being vulnerable. And secondary responses, you can think about them as they are the things that we do when we are more defended or in a self-protective state. So we feel a vulnerable feeling and we need to protect ourselves against that feeling. And so we move into the secondary responses, which is going to be a more defended or self-protected state. Here are some emotional examples of what I'm referring to. So everything below the line is considered a primary emotion, and everything above the line is considered a secondary response. So for example, if I get my feelings hurt, I might become angry. Or if I feel unimportant in a relationship, I might distance myself and become cold or aloof. Or if I feel rejected by somebody, I might become really irritated. So everything below the line is what we call a primary emotion because it has a very vulnerable aspect to it. And everything everything above the line is considered a secondary response because it has a more self-protected aspect. Okay? So let's take a look at how this might play out in real life. I'm going to share a fictional story with you guys to show you what this looks like. So this is the story of Sally and Jen. Sally and Jen. Okay, so here we go. Jen showed up one morning at work late. She had promised Sally that she would arrive by 8 a.m. so the two of them could tackle a big project together. But she actually didn't get there until 9 a.m., so she was an hour late, and she didn't even call. Can you believe that? She innocently forgot about her commitment to be in the office by 8 a.m. to help Sally. So she shows up an hour late and she didn't call. When she arrived at 9 a.m., she knew instantly something was wrong. Sally wouldn't even look at her. And Jen's attempts to greet her were met with a piercing look that could ignite a war. Jen realized that she was in trouble instantly when she saw how angry Sally was, and this made Jen feel really anxious and nervous. She tried to explain herself, but it didn't work, and eventually she walked away very frustrated and said, "You're always so uptight." So the two co-workers, they kept their distance from each other for the rest of the morning, and both spent a big part of the day feeling angry, irritated, and really confused. So what happened here? Can we dissect this interaction and understand the primary emotions versus the secondary responses and how this interplays with their conflict? Here we go. So I'm going to show you graphically what this looks like and paint a picture in your mind of how this plays out. So hopefully it can be a tool for you to remember. Okay, so we have primary emotions below the line, secondary responses above the line. We've already covered that. And I'm using this infinity symbol here to illustrate their relationship dynamic and the flow of emotion that happens between them. So on the left side is Jen, and on the right side is Sally. Okay? So here we go. Jen showed up an hour late, and from a vulnerable emotion standpoint, Sally felt blown off, she felt like she doesn't matter, and she felt disrespected. It's like, ouch, right? Very big, very painful feelings. It doesn't feel good. That's what Sally felt. And then what Sally does is she takes all of those feelings and she goes above this line into secondary responses. So she moves from primary emotion to secondary responses. And what does she do instead? She shows a strong, angry reaction. She becomes cold and she won't engage with Jen. She kind of shuts her out because she's really ticked off. So it's important that I want you to see here the movement from primary emotion into secondary reactions. And remember, Jen doesn't completely understand that her showing up late was kind of an innocent mistake. She had forgotten, so she doesn't fully understand why she's receiving such strong emotion from Sally. Sally takes all that strong emotion and she delivers it down to Jen. And what does Jen feel? Jen starts to feel anxious or worried or stressed. There's a heightened kind of stress response going on inside of her. She feels criticized, and she has this sense that like she's always in trouble. She feels like she can't do anything right. That's what Jen starts to feel. And then Jen takes all those primary emotions, goes above the line to secondary responses. And what does Jen do? She walks away and she avoids Sally. And then eventually she gets really ticked off and says something like, "You're always so uptight." So I want you to see the movement from primary emotion into secondary responses. And then she takes that, the walking away and the anger, and she delivers that back down to Sally, who ultimately at the beginning of the story was hurt. Okay? And what happens here, the reason this is an infinity symbol is because this relationship dynamic ultimately just feeds on itself. And over time, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and grows larger and larger and larger. And the conflict just gets more entrenched. Okay? So, does any of this sound familiar? If it does, I want you to know that you're not alone. Every single relationship experiences some cycle similar to this. And the more we can understand these types of interactions, the more we will develop the tools to learn how to get out of them. So let's change the slide, and I'm going to keep talking through this example. So, same process, and we're going to talk about it in just a slightly different way. Sally felt blown off. We could put maybe a couple different words in there, but from a vulnerable standpoint, she just felt like she was dismissed. And then she went above the line to that fight space. Okay. And Jen felt like she was in trouble, and she went above the line to that more flight space. Okay. Because remember, I said another way to refer to secondary responses are our fight and flight mechanisms. Okay. When we get scared or we feel like we need to protect ourselves, we either fight or flight, and all of us have a predisposition to kind of do one or the other. The term fighter in a relational aspect refers to the tendency to kind of lash out when we feel relationship stress, and the term flighter refers to the tendency to withdraw when we feel relationship stress. Another way to think about it is below the line, this would be their being vulnerable to discuss their relationship in the context of these emotions, like I felt blown off or I felt like I was in trouble, and to interact with each other above the line is what we consider more self-protected or a defended way of interacting with each other. And all conflict exists when people are interacting with each other what we call above this line. So when we're in that defended, self-protected, secondary response state, this is where all of that ugly conflict exists between people. And the way out of all conflict is learning how to come back below the line and discuss what's happening from an emotional standpoint and ultimately identifying our core human needs. So the unmet needs, so let me back up a second. So let's start from the top and we'll work our way down to the bottom. So you guys know what secondary responses are. That's the examples are, anger, shutting down, being controlling, being critical. Those are all considered secondary responses. And their purpose is to be self-protective. But as we are self-protected in that way, they are also anti-relational because it keeps people away from us. It keeps people at a distance from us. And ultimately, what we want is people to feel safe enough to be close to us. That's why I say they're anti-relational. And it's the primary emotions that drive those secondary responses. So it's feelings like being fearful, anxious, hurt, sad, unimportant. We could find a lot of words there, but it's that vulnerable emotion that we feel, and we feel like we have to protect ourselves from revealing that side. So we defend ourselves and move into the secondary responses. And it's those vulnerable emotions that we really want to cherish and value in relationships, because that's what leads ultimately to authentic connection. The more we can stay below the line in that primary emotional space, the more we're going to feel a lot more connected and safe with each other. And it's this idea of basic core human needs being unmet that drive all of our primary emotions that ultimately lead to all those secondary responses. So these are our basic relational needs that generate these emotional responses. And these needs are present in all relationships that matter to us. So parenting relationship, spousal relationship, business partnerships. Okay. So first, it's that secondary responses that we're just trying to stay away from as much as we can. Next, we're trying to identify or become more aware of the primary emotions that are leading to the secondary responses. And then one step even lower or one step further is identifying these core human needs that we all have and that we all need that are ultimately at the roots of all conflict. So let's take a look at what these core human needs are. The 7 core human needs. I'm just going to go through them, okay? So it's a need for security, a need for significance, a need for acceptance, a need for mutuality, a need for self-expression, a need for freedom, and a need for dependability. When these needs are not being met in the context of important relationships for us, the result is going to be conflict. So conversely, the way out of conflict, or the way back to harmony in relationship, is identifying which of these 7 core needs are not being addressed and need to be tended to. So these needs, this is the root of all conflict, and conflict also dissipates when we know how to articulate these core human needs and how to empathically respond to them. So here are a couple examples. So number one, when we don't feel security, we might silently disengage and look for a new job or look for a new partner. When we don't feel significance, we might yell, we might be demanding, and we might insist that we're heard. When we don't feel acceptance, we might withdraw, we might shut down, and we might just stop showing up in the relationship. When we don't feel like things are mutual, we might complain and get angry and talk about fairness. You can see how all these things become conflicts. When we don't feel like we can express ourselves, we'll get controlling. We'll get controlling of others, or we might even become passive aggressive. When we don't feel enough freedom, we become rogue operators and start saying, well, the heck with it, I'm just going to do it my way. And when we don't feel enough dependability, we might get fearful that we are on our own and that we can't trust others. And I want you to see how these 7 core needs and associated primary emotions are at the roots of all conflict. And so, attending to these core needs and associated emotions is the answer in solving all conflict and getting out of that really stuck space. So next time you're feeling mad at somebody, next time you're feeling like, I really don't like this person, I would invite you to consider what it is that you might truly be feeling from a vulnerable standpoint. That would be the primary emotions. And what are one or several of these core human needs that are not getting tended to in your relationship? Because the quicker we can identify that, or the quicker as a leader or a manager we can identify that in others, the quicker we're going to get to the root of conflict and ultimately be able to solve it. So I want to share with you 4 rules to live by for healthy conflict resolution. And these are 4 very simple rules, and ultimately these are the things that matter most in getting out of those really stuck conflictual spaces. Okay, they're very simple, but they're not easy to do. Okay, and they're not impossible. They just take us slowing down a little bit, thinking through some stuff, and trying to make sense of things. So 4 rules to live by. The first rule is that we just simply have to recognize when somebody is above the line in that secondary response space. Okay, so it's really just about developing some awareness, realizing like, oh, okay, I think somebody got hurt about something, and now they're in that secondary space. They might be angry, they might be shutting down, they might be withdrawing, they might be controlling. So simply just developing the awareness when somebody is above the line or in that secondary space. Number 2, what we want to do is we want to role model to others, and we want to ask others, those that we care about or the relationships that are important to us, we want to ask them to stay below the line with us. So if you're in a relationship with somebody and they're getting controlling, or they're getting antagonistic, and they're getting really angry, or you see them shutting down, and you see them disappearing, you see them withdrawing, ask them to engage with you in that vulnerable way. Ask them to stay below the line with you. Ask them to share with you what it is they're really feeling. And they might say, well, I'm just feeling really ticked off. And then you can say, well, I totally understand that you're feeling ticked off, but I'm wondering if you're probably feeling hurt by something I said or something that happened. Okay, so we want to role model this experiential way of relating with people, and we want to invite people into that type of a conversation because that is how we get out of the conflict. The third rule is that we want to connect one of those 7 core needs to the situation or the experience. We want to try to connect this emotional experience to one of those needs. So maybe somebody's feeling like they're not being accepted. Maybe somebody's feeling like they don't have enough security. Maybe somebody's feeling like there's not enough mutuality in the relationship. It's one of those needs that's driving all of this energy. And so when we can start talking about that with people, when we can start engaging people in a conversation about one of those 7 core needs, magic starts to happen in the relationship. And that's the last rule I wanted to share with you is we're trying to engage with one another in a conversation below the line in that primary emotional space where we can talk about the primary emotions and we can connect those primary emotions to an unmet or an untended to core need. Okay, so here are 3 questions that can help you gain insight into conflict potential. Okay, these are 3 questions that you can use in any relationship, you can use on yourself, you can use on somebody else, but these are 3 questions that are going to help you navigate a lot of insight and a lot of self-awareness around this stuff. So the first question is, what is your predominant secondary response? So meaning we all have kind of like knee-jerk or instinctual or go-to reactions that we all do in that secondary response place. You're either a fighter or you're a flighter, typically. And we all have kind of a predominant way of reacting in that secondary space. And what I want you to think about is, what is that for you? What does that look like for you? What do you kind of do? And connected to that, what is the predominant primary emotion that leads to this secondary response? So it's the same thing. You know, there's a list of 100, let's say, primary emotions, and I could send you that list. I could say, well, here's a list of 100 primary emotions. But the truth is, there's only a couple of those words that really matter to us because our trigger points as humans, they are very repetitive, they're very predictable, and there's a couple words that really are kind of like our words. So it might be like, well, every time I feel unimportant, that's when I go to that dark space. Or every time I feel controlled by somebody, that's when I go to that dark space. So what is your predominant primary emotion that leads to your secondary response? And then the third question is, what is the predominant core human need that activates that emotional response in you? Because we have the 7, but usually it's usually like one or 2 of those needs really shows up often in our lives. Okay, it's not like it's always 7 and we're always trying to figure out which one of the 7. It's usually like 1 or 2 that seem to be the ones that really matter to us. So what is that for you? Is it the mutuality? Is it the acceptance? Is it the dependability? Is it the security, right? So we want to just really think about that. We want to think about what that is. And then also consider all 3 of these questions for the people that matter to you. So for your business partner, your executive team, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your relationship with your adult child that you are having a hard time connecting with. If you can develop more insight into these 3 questions for the people that matter to you or the people that are close to you in your life, I promise you, you are going to move from that icky, difficult, conflictual space into a connected, harmonious, bonding space in a relationship, and that's where it feels so good. Okay, so I hope that's helpful to you guys. And If you have any questions about it, wherever you find this video, please shoot me an email. And if there's anything I can do to help you build better connections and reducing conflict with your team or the people that matter to you, feel free to visit my website, quentinhafner.com, and shoot me a message. I would love to hear from you. Okay, take care.